I'm going to begin by contextualizing this talk. As Pirko suggests, this talk is based on something I've already published, and as Jonathan Burrows said yesterday, when you publish something, in a sense, you're free of the ideas. So this is about me trying to come back to ideas that I have, in a sense, freed myself of. It's also about me trying to come back to a set of ideas in a way that is going to be relevant to this event. So I'm going to revisit some of the material I talked about in that chapter, which was contributed to a book called Choreography und Institution, a German language anthology edited by Yvonne Hart and Martin Stern. In that article, I compared two festivals that were roughly associated with the 1980s, so they're historical examples. One was the Festival of India, which was a large-scale global showcase, and the other is a localized celebration of the genre known as British New Dance. Since that time, I've become interested in several new research areas, and I'd like to kind of connect this talk to some of the new work I've been doing. One of those is the study of tourism, so looking into the tourism literature, tourism studies, but also the representation of dance within tourism. Another research area has to do with an entry that I wrote for a volume called Dance and War, edited by Jens Giersdorf and Gay Morris. And that article actually kind of brought to fruition a long-term interest that I've had in the use of Bharatanatyam by Sri Lankan Tamils to express a counter-state nationalist identity. This thinking about dance's relationship to war, wars of both the hot and cold variety, kind of led me into an entirely new research area, which is an investigation of the discourse of American exceptionalism as articulated through early and mid-century modern dance. In that research, which I've just begun very recently, I've started thinking about imperial, post-colonial, and utopian discourses that play themselves out in the formation of something that is self-described as a new American art form. Through that process, I've been thinking a bit about dance's relationship to the legacy of colonial exhibition, particularly World's Fairs, and dance and diplomacy ventures. So, a lot of this material seems to have very little to do with Tanzkongress and with Tanzhaus and its interest in African and African diaspora forums. It seems to have very little to do with this Central European context. However, I'm going to suggest in this talk, and these are really a series of speculations, I think I'm raising questions rather than providing answers here, but I'm going to suggest that the legacy of colonial exhibition and the relationship of dance to diplomacy and policy actually link some of these historical examples. The two festivals I'm talking about, Festival of India and Dance Umbrella, they link to American modern dance and also to present-day festivals like this Tanzkongress event. My argument is that we contend with the legacy of colonial exhibition in the same way that we continue to grapple with colonialism itself. I also want to suggest that we still confront the legacy of the Cold War as we talk about dance and globalization. This talk is kind of a series of speculations about festival structure, and that's sort of what I hope to focus on. I'd like to sort of put forward concepts that will help us debate both the content and structure of events like this. I'm aware that, as I say this, that there are historical specificities to be accounted for. First of all, Germany has a radically different imperial history than the ones I'm familiar with. And so some of these issues that I raise may be transferable, some may not be. And of course, also Germany once stood at the very center of First World, Second World conflict. So some of the issues that I raise around capitalist economics and the Cold War played out very differently in this national context. Okay, so in terms of the structure of this presentation, I want to revisit some of the Festival of India and Dance Umbrella discussion. And through that, I'm going to discuss dance's relationship to tourism, as well as to colonial ethnography and diplomacy. I'm going to conclude this talk by updating some of that material and discussing this Tanzkongress event as it sheds light on some of these issues. And I apologize to the translator because I'm going to be doing some of this on the fly. Okay, so the Festival of India, launched in 1982, extended to other nations, launched in Britain in 1982, and then it extended to other nations, including the United States, France, the Soviet Union, Germany, and China. It was extensive, spectacular, and ostensibly comprehensive in its portrayal of something that was identified as Indian culture. It followed a similar format from one country to the next. So, for example, in any given city, venues would offer a survey of performances of classical dance, North and South Indian classical music, as well as folk and popular music. Museums ran India-themed exhibitions, like this event at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Village masters would demonstrate their crafts for audiences in galleries, lecture halls, and other public spaces. So like, for example, the Smithsonian event had crafts exhibitions at the open-air site of the Washington Mall. In the British Festival of India, there were presentations at the Museum of Mankind, which is now the British Museum. Festival of India was institutionally driven and officially sanctioned. It was the brainchild of the British ambassador to India, and it became a project of then Prime Ministers Indira Gandhi and Margaret Thatcher. So there was a literal centrality to the Festival of India. Sites for performance included participating cities, largest and most important venues. The centrality, though, was also metaphoric. So it was the key star performers of Indian arts of the 1980s. Festival of India was also global in its aims and impact. So it was designed very clearly as a diplomatic gesture. It was an outreach to the global powers of the time, as well as also, interestingly, an outreach to post-colonial nations that had a significant Indian diaspora population. So the Festival of India, this link to work, because I've been having some technological problems this morning. Yes, okay. What's that? Oh, slow down. Sorry, okay. I've been asked to speak more slowly for simultaneous translation. Okay, so Dance Umbrella used a similar terminology to the Festival of India, but at the beginning it had a very different aim and function. It was designed as a showcase of independent performance, and it was centered around the Riverside Studio, which is a small independent venue in London. So at the beginning, as much as Festival of India was large-scale, official, and globally oriented, Dance Umbrella was at first localized and grassroots in its celebration of contemporary dance. That said, it had a transnational reach, even to its earliest showcases. So artists who would come to exemplify contemporary dance performance in mainland Europe, Britain, and North America in the 1980s featured at Dance Umbrella events. Gradually, over its 30-year history, Dance Umbrella has emerged as a mainstream showcase in which the world's most prominent contemporary dance companies appear in London's most significant venues. So there's a commonality between these two festivals, which is that the festival was created as a response to a perceived lack. And indeed, in the writings on festivals, and a lot of the literature on festivals, there's this idea that's put forward that festivals are often a response to either crisis or lack of some form. In this case, the festivals were created in response to a perceived lack in international awareness of the cultural life of the country in question. So the Festival of India was created in order to foster international appreciation of Indian arts, culture, and tradition. The creators of Dance Umbrella devised their festival in order to offset an assumption that contemporary dance in Britain was derivative of North American and mainland European dance. Despite this commonality in objective, they sort of follow opposite trajectories. So the Festival of India was official, spectacularized, and global in its reach, and as such, it sparked the emergence of a counter-festival called the Festival of India in Britain, which was a localized grassroots series that emphasized diasporic practice. Dance Umbrella kind of had the opposite trajectory. It started out as independent, local, and resistant to mainstream arts programming, and as it ran over succeeding years, it's gradually become legitimized and high profile. So my main point here, the issue I want to put forward for potential debate, is that these contrasting trajectories raise questions about the politics of festival programming, and they prompt discussion about the possibility or impossibility of a resistant festival. I'm suggesting that they provide an arena for examining the politics of display and for considering alternatives to dominant modes of exhibition and viewing. So I want to spend a little time exploring festival structure and its relationship to several different histories. First of all, I'm going to propose that there's a relationship between colonial scholarship and cultural tourism that informs festival structure, and that festivals are also engaged with imperial practices of display, dance and diplomacy, and the construction of national identity. Dance festivals in particular, I'm suggesting, are undergirded by an ability that dance has to operate as an emblem of cultural distinctiveness. This is a phenomenon that Jane Desmond talks about as the destination image, which expresses the sum of associations with a place. Desmond's example is, of course, the highly exoticized image of the hula girl, where the visual image of the dance practitioner comes to embody all of these different associations with a geographical site. So in this sense, I'm suggesting that dance can operate as a sort of snapshot or postcard. And as Desmond points out, through the destination image, culture in the sense of the arts conflates with culture in the sense of a way of life. And I'm going to put forward the suggestion that this conflation happens through the intersection between tourism and colonial scholarship. Okay, so one link between festivals and tourism is that they both choreograph travel. They structure the movements of bodies in both an immediate and a transnational space. But that's a kind of surface level connection, and I want to also suggest that there is an intersection in intellectual history between the construction of culture and its representation in travel and performance. I'm also sort of suggesting that festivals rely upon an anthropological gaze in that they frequently operate within a kind of traditional Boasian anthropological mode. They constitute a collection of cultural artifacts, albeit a temporary one. Cultural tourism also operates in collection mode. So just to kind of, I'm going to very briefly run through a kind of history of tourism to kind of bring us back to that insight that tourism operates as a form of collection. So originally, the aims of European and subsequently North American tourism in the 18th and early 19th centuries lay in the immersion of, in the culture of a tourism site, so the kind of grand tour model of tourism. In this case, culture aligned with art, architecture, language, and ways of life. The European health movements that emerged in the 19th century and then the development of mass travel in the mid to late 19th century opened up travel to the working classes. Alongside these methods of mass transit, this phenomenon of the sort of democratization of travel led to the vacation superseding the cultural tour. The late 20th century has seen a longing for the exotic combined with an intentional rejection of package tours so that tourists develop strategies for differentiating their travel from that of their peers. So in other words, there's this phenomenon where tourists travel to escape other tourists. Probably the clearest example is the novel and the film The Beach, which is a very clear enactment of that phenomenon. The literary critic James Buzzard argues that anti-tourism actually is not a kind of 20th century phenomenon at all, but that it's right there at the center of discourse at the time when mass tourism appeared. But Buzzard actually is talking about fairly elite forms of representation, like he talks about Henry James embracing a kind of anti-tourism, whereas what I see going on in the late 20th and the 21st century is actually anti-tourism embedded right into mass tourism itself. So there continues to be a kind of need to differentiate touristic practice on the part of the tourist from that of their peers. So one strategy that gets used is to add a consequential purpose to travel. So for example, ecotourism comes under this category, and cultural tourism does as well. So I'm kind of suggesting that styles of travel have come full circle, from the grand tours of cultural immersion to health-oriented vacations to cultural tourism. But there's a key difference between today's cultural tourism and the grand tours of the past. So in cultural tourism, culture is condensed and encapsulated and packaged. It's not a site of immersion, but it's a kind of artifact to be purchased. Performance is increasingly important to cultural tourism because it ostensibly provides precisely this encapsulation of culture. performance is frequently seen as mere entertainment at home, but abroad, things like dance, music, and theater add a sense of intellectual depth and, in fact, a utopian promise of cross-cultural understanding when experienced abroad. This process, I want to suggest that this process of marking sites and practices as cultural emerges out of anthropological and other colonial scholarly writings. So my suggestion is that once anthropologists and other writers bring a location to prominence as exotic and as worthy of attention by virtue of its culture, the cultural site then draws the attention of lay travelers. This cultural importance, which of course is layered with this kind of exoticized desire, gives a sense of seriousness to travel, and it links tourism to intellectual endeavors and differentiates cultural from recreational tourism. So this is a process that's kind of familiar from sites such as Hawaii, Bali, and Java. These sort of anthropologized, what I'm calling anthropologized sites, become identified as different and appealing through cultural markers, and then those cultural markers validate them as tourist destinations. This process is also unfolding in other less overtly touristic sites, and what I think is interesting to look at is how less overtly touristic sites are actually embracing this, this phenomenon of anthropologizing themselves. Something that gets talked about in the tourism literature is how tourism is seen as a sort of system for automatically generating revenue. So there's kind of a vested interest in creating a tourism market. And this tourism market often operates, I'm suggesting that it operates through these kinds of markers of cultural difference. So the example that I'm drawing from is the Indian tourist campaigns, and I'm doing that because it's a region I have some experience with, but it's also both actually as a scholar and in a sense as a tourist, but it's also a region that I've had experience with over a 20-year period, so I've actually seen the development of tourism literature in relation to the Indian national context. But I'm hoping that these interpretations are possibly generalizable, or they can be extended to other national sites. So India has sort of long been identified through colonial and post-colonial discourse as a rugged rather than luxurious destination. So the colonial image of the old India hand, the kind of image of heat and dust, the kind of neo-Orientalist spiritual nostalgia that kind of played out with seekers, New Age seekers going to India to find themselves, and later club kids going to India to lose themselves. So India, it doesn't automatically come to mind as this sort of luxurious destination. However, the Indian government has identified tourism as a potential major industry and has promoted it through events like India Now and the Incredible India campaigns. So in the India Tourist Board literature and promotional material, there's precisely a desire to present India as a cultural site and one that is sort of not marked as a sort of backpacker destination. So if I can get the tech to work for me here. There's a kind of conflation of anthropological narratives, tourism, and economics, which appears, I think, quite strikingly in Secretary of Tourism Amitabh Kant's idea of branding India. So this idea is, when you see it kind of spelled out so literally like that, it looks quite striking, this kind of conflation of national identity, culture, and capitalist consumption. But it's actually not unusual in either tourism literature or in dance and diplomacy ventures. And I'll come back to this later, but this is actually a kind of common strategy that, to conflate national identity, culture, and consumption. Okay, so in the case of the Indian Tourist Bureau campaigns, there's a very clear kind of continuity from colonial scholarship foregrounding a binary division between East and West, an assumption that India's glories lay in the past, and a proliferation of customs, peoples, and tribes identified through imperialist racial taxonomies. Likewise, the tourist industry in India emphasizes ancient tradition in the form of India's classical performance forms. lavish Mughal and or Rajasthani royal architecture, and a proliferation of local culture through tribal and folk dance and music presentations. In each of these instances, culture establishes the site as a tourist destination and validates tourism because it offers a promise of understanding instead of only entertainment and relaxation. So another link between tourism and festivals is that festivals often provide an abridgment of traditional or indigenous practices. And performance is often summarized for ease of comprehension and consumption. And I'm just noting the time, so I think I'm going to skip ahead to talking about the destination image. The destination image is central to this process where a cultural site gets marked as validated for tourism. It's a phenomenon that's more recognizable in depictions of Hawaii and Bali, where dance appears as a destination image, but it's also starting to appear in Indian Tourist Bureau campaigns. As an aside, I kind of like the postmodern qualities of this image, where it's a photograph of a train passenger photographing the image of the dancers that are used to promote tourism. What I think is striking in relation to the India Tourist Bureau campaigns is that there's a global proliferation of many of these forms that get featured. And a tourist from Houston, London, Mexico City, or Stockholm is probably just as likely, or almost as likely, to see Bharatanatyam, Odissi, or Kathak in a local venue as they would in a theater in India. And yet these images sort of function as a way of drawing tourist attention. So this is just one of the many instances in which national tourist bureaus create advertisements that market countries as destinations through dance, and in which dance operates not only as a shorthand, but actually as an advertisement for culture. So moving on to a discussion of dance umbrella. Dance umbrella at first glance doesn't appear to festivalize culture because it promotes contemporary dance, which is identified as universal and not culturally specific. And in fact, dance umbrella kind of naturalizes a dance culture and integrates it with its environment. And it appears to operate outside tourist industry networks. However, I want to suggest that there is actually a link to tourism because for the UK, as for many developing nations, international tourism is a major industry. Although the UK is clearly not exoticized. Because of the rise of US imperialism, it's often seen as a kind of fated empire, and its great civilization is located in the past. American tourists in particular travel to the UK to see the evidence of the greatness of the UK's past. But also a lot of tourists travel to, particularly London, to witness culture in the sense of performance, particularly theater. Tourists who might never see a dramatic production, and again, hopefully the tech will help me out here. Tourists who might never see a dramatic production in their home countries will attend nope, the tech situation failed me. I knew it would. That was gonna be an image of West End Theater, so. Tourists will often go to see theater productions in London when they would never go to see a theater production in their hometown. And there's an interesting parallel to the instance of Indian classical dance because there's also a globalization of theater productions where it may be the very same play that is being performed in London in the case of Billy Elliot or Les Miserables or various large-scale productions like that that can be witnessed anywhere in the world, but there's something about seeing it in London that makes it a distinctive experience. Okay, so one of the things I'm arguing here is that tourism and festivals are both part of a history of spectacular phenomena, such as colonial exhibitions, world fairs, and showcases, and they signal a relationship between viewing, display, and the exercise of power. Colonial exhibitions exercised imperial control through the practicalities of display, like that they brought individuals from foreign countries and convinced them to display their ways of life in public, but also through a relationship between looking, learning, and representation. So there's a kind of conflation of education, spectacle, and display, something that Eric Larson has called the ardor of science. Festival of India and Dance Umbrella both represent national identity. So for Festival of India, Indian culture is about heritage, largely. and the idea of a living tradition. Classical dance was quite prominent, contemporary dance less so, and in striking contrast to how something like that would probably be curated today, film and popular dance were absent. Initially, in the London Festival of India, it featured only Indian rather than diasporic artists as well. So, again, I'm keeping an eye on time. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk briefly about the Festival of India as a diplomatic gesture that hinged specifically on economic intentions. So there was a clear reversal of the former socialist policies, Indian socialist policies, and here it kind of comes back to the Cold War connection that I invoked earlier. This was apparent in events like that were called things like India, Your Business Partner, or festival brochure articles such as India, the world's 10th largest economy. What I want to suggest here is that this strategy is absolutely not uncommon. So, for example, the U.S. World's Fairs were about national integration in the wake of the Civil War. They were also about establishing the U.S. as an imperial power through representation. But crucially, they were also about stimulating interest in U.S. products abroad. So it was about economic colonialism as well. Likewise, countries like Japan actually agreed to participate in the U.S. World Fairs despite the stereotypical terms in which they were being represented because they were drawn by the promise of new markets. So Dance Umbrella also relied on the international movement of dancers and choreographers, and they also integrated their performance with national identity. Prior to the 1970s, concert dance was brought from North America and Europe into Britain. This established contemporary dance in the UK, but suggested that concert dance was not native to Britain. There was also a very specific set of economic concerns around Dance Umbrella. Crucially, Dance Umbrella was part of a shift from European to American understandings of capitalism. It was a response to cuts in public funding, so there was an embrace of a low relative cost of production. And also, I think it might have been in response to decades of the export of U.S. modern dance through State Department tours, that Dance Umbrella was structured or sort of proposed this idea that an American economic model would allow modern and experimental dance to flourish under the banner of free enterprise. The Festival of India is seemingly less politically marked than Dance Umbrella is seemingly less politically marked than the Festival of India. But I want to suggest that it negotiates Britain's post-war, post-imperial position. So Dance Umbrella's compensatory moves have less to do with an anthropologizing of culture and rather with a more specific dance-related deficit in awareness, a perception that contemporary dance in Britain is derivative of North America and Europe. Okay, so by way of concluding, I want to revisit the politics of display briefly, and then I want to invoke some of the issues we've been talking about here at Tanzkongress. First of all, I want to consider how a present-day festival can move away from some of these modalities of colonial exhibitions, World's Fairs, and dance and diplomacy ventures. I'm going to go back to the historical examples very briefly, and then I'm going to talk a bit about Tanzkongress. So, as I suggested at the beginning of this talk, the Festival of India prompted the emergence of a counter-festival called the Festival of India in Britain. So, for example, as much as the Festival of India was located in these mainstream events, the Festival of India in Britain was, offered events that took place in public spaces that were free, open to the public, etc. The Festival of India in Britain specifically had an activist agenda. It was similar to Dance Umbrella in that sense, and it challenged the festival programming of the Festival of India, specifically by focusing on diasporic arts and highlighting the irony of excluding diasporic artists from something that was a globalized celebration of difference. Similarly, the Festival of India actually kind of glossed over colonialism and talked euphemistically about a long-standing relationship between Britain and India. The Festival of India in Britain actually highlighted colonialism, diaspora, migration, etc. So my suggestion here is that there are specific aesthetic and presentational strategies that will allow a festival to operate as resistant instead of as hegemonic. Some of these strategies include localizing gestures, specifically ones that foreground colonialism and other forms of international violence. Gestures that include diaspora and migration, discussions, choreographic and verbal, that problematize the nation and the fixity of national borders, and that call attention to historical specificity rather than some kind of timeless cultural meaning, and also events and practices that allow for self-critique. So in other words, I'm looking for moments that subvert the ardor of science, in Eric Larson's terms, or what we might call the ardor of aesthetics, the seamless association of display, power, and knowledge. So very briefly, I'm going to focus on some of the events in this program that I think accomplish some of these aims. The caveat here is that I've been talking about structure, and in these concluding remarks, I'm actually going to talk about content. So Faustin Linicula's work is a clear example of choreography that does not treat colonialism euphemistically. Linicula's work reminds us that colonialism actually undergirds the transnationalism, and that colonialism is, in a sense, what brings us here to the transnational moment. His attention to the process of looking reminds us to continually question the imperial underpinnings of our gazes. Also, the discussions we've been having across panels, I think, accomplish some of the work I've been talking about, the destabilization of ideas of fixity, the discussion of sovereignty struggles, discussions of spaces of uncertainty, the image of interweaving with its notion of instability built into it. So one of the things that I think Festival of India in Britain and Dance Umbrella show us has to do with questions around temporality. Specifically, the Festival of India in Britain was a fixed-term event. Dance Umbrella suggests that festivals might lose their capacity to challenge as they become institutionalized. So while Tanzkongress is an ongoing event, it's a relatively new one, and I'm suggesting that it features a possible elasticity of structure and a promise of critique that a temporary festival also offers. There's an integration of forms of exchange here, performances, workshops, discussions, et cetera. And so I think this is a moment of opportunity. The programming that we see here kind of raises further questions about festival structure and its possibility for destabilizing conventional perceptions of performance forms. So it raises questions like, can a festival be resistant and ongoing? Or does its very structure promote stabilization? Can content challenge form? Yaktin Lin, who's also written about festivals, suggests that festivals can be understood as contact zones, sites of collaboration and exchange. This positive take on festivals implies that despite their link to imperial display, they can be refigured such that their creators and participants stage critique and self-critique through exchange. If the festival structure is adjusted, interrogated, and continually problematized, perhaps it can maximize the capacity of dance to challenge, question, and destabilize conventional interpretations of culture. And I think I will conclude there because I realize I'm over time. Thank you. So I think we have about 5 minutes for questions. Is that right? Yeah.
I was quite interested in your comment on Dance Umbrella and the universalizing of contemporary dance with the festival, and also thinking about the development of the festival. Maybe you can just say a little bit more about that in the context of your critique, I suppose.
Yeah.
What does the contemporary do in that festival, if you wanted to? Are you seeing that as a colonialist strategy, or is it opening collaborations that facilitate critique and debate, as we are seeing here, for example, with Faustin's work? Because I think he would be a good example of contemporary dance that allows for that critique to emerge. So could you say a bit more about that, perhaps?
Yeah, sure, I'd be glad to. And I realize I kind of raced through some of that discussion. So just to clarify, I don't see Dance Umbrella as a kind of colonialist venture at all. My argument, which I realize I kind of breezed through, is not so much that Dance Umbrella universalizes, but that it's deploying contemporary dance, which is already marked as international and universal. From 1978 to the present, one of the things Dance Umbrella has contended with, and I think contended with quite actively is the repeated challenges to the unmarked qualities of contemporary dance, the way in which contemporary dance has been refigured and rethought from the post-colonial world, from the standpoint of diasporic practice, disability dance, queer representation in dance. So, from 1978 to the present, there's been a real destabilization of contemporary dance. In thinking about Dance Umbrella, there's kind of an interesting trajectory, because on the one hand, it's become institutionalized, it's become kind of mainstream, and there is that possibility that it might be losing the ability to resist. At the same time, what it is doing is it's accounting for all these different interpretations of the contemporary, and that's actually kind of more resistant than the 1978 articulation. So it's kind of doing both of those things at once. I think all of these events that allow for critique and self-critique in different kinds of ways are renegotiating the festival structure. And I think that's one of the benefits of, in a sense, a benefit of the marginal status of dance in a lot of these national contexts, including contemporary dance, is that self-critique, there's space for self-critique within it, and self-critique kind of reemerges at various points in the process. Thank you.
I've been doing some research on the critical potential of curating festivals or curating seasonal programs, and in the performing arts, not specifically in dance, but in performing arts. And I've had to realize that hardly any curator defines his own practice as critical or self-critical regarding the institutionalization. But the only examples I found where curators really tried to, I quote you, localize, specify on a historical level and practice self-critique as curators were artist curators. So I was wondering if, for example, in the context of the Festival of India in Britain, if artist curators play a role or not?
That's a really good point, and that's probably crucial, is that the Festival of India in Britain was an activist organization formed by artists, as opposed to a festival that was structured by people who position themselves primarily as curators. So that's a really crucial distinction. These sort of grassroots kind of festivals are often led not just by something that's localized, but something that is artist-led. And I think the discourse around artistic practice is often quite different than the discourse around curatorial practice, so that artistic forms, we're used to them being debated. We're used to the idea that the artist has to represent him or herself and has to, and is expected to self-critique to some extent. And that's a little bit different from the discussion that often goes on around curation. So these grassroots festivals are often ones that are artist-led and that therefore have a self-critique built into them in a different kind of way. Yeah, so thank you for calling that to the forefront.